This year of 1991 marks a double anniversary for Sharon, the bicentennial of its incorporation as a town and the 100th anniversary of the Sharon Reunion. Hello, I'm Lorraine Denis of Spring Mill Road, and I'll be visiting with neighbors who have lived in Sharon for many years and listening to their stories of Sharon's past. House is Abram Collier of Temple Road. As a member of the Bicentennial Committee, Mr. Collier has been reviewing Sharon history and hopes to have his notes on the history published after the reunion. Mr. Collier was chairman of the New England Mutual Life Insurance Company in Boston and chairman of the Boston Symphony. He has been a summer resident of the area since the early 50s and has had a home in Sharon since 1975. Early settlers, and where did they come from?
Well, there were quite a few that came up here in the 1750s and 60s. Actually, probably 15 or 20 families settled in this area. There were Puritans, some of them came from the Massachusetts mostly. Some of them were Scotch-Irish that came originally from the northern part of Ireland, having been displaced in Scotland.
What was life like in Sharon, or Slip Town, before 1791?
Well, there were these few families here. That's what you have to remember. Sharon was a township, not a town. They were not self-governing. They couldn't levy taxes. Everything was done in the town had to be voluntary. But it's interesting. In 1796, they held the first town meeting even though they were not incorporated as a town. And that was in response to the Second Continental Congress. Congress wanted money, and so even little Sharon decided to send some money to the Revolutionary armies.
What did they work at? What was their occupation mainly?
Mainly, they cut trees down, they had oxen, of course, brought up some cows and horses, hens, pigs, and they earned their own way. They burned the trees for fertilizer. They made out just by living on the land.
Well, so the answer to what life was like was hard, I guess, on these early settlers.
No question about that.
Were there Indians in the area at this time?
Not very many. Peterborough had an Indian problem in the 1740s, and the road to Peterborough came through Sharon at that time, and Peterborough people left town for several years, came back in about 1749 and 50. But after that, the Indian threat was there, and there was a militia in Sharon as late as 1850.
And what was life like in Sharon after 1791?
Well, it's interesting. This school is a result of the first school that was authorized the year before incorporation, actually. And there was a big squabble between the people who lived in this part of town, the east, and the people who lived in the west part of Sharon, which is where the West Hill School was built. Where the school was to be, they made a decision that Solomon might have made. They said, well, let's have two schools. So they had District 1 over in the west and District 2 right here.
I guess this was the closest thing to a center that Sharon ever had. I've heard this was called Sharon City here around the brick schoolhouse.
Well, I think people in this part of town called it Sharon City. That was their way of saying to everybody else, this is the important part of the town.
And when was this school built?
This school, actually, the brick school was built in 1832. The previous wooden school, previous wooden schools having burned down.
So there were 3 schools in Sharon.
The third one was built in the southern part of town by Dr. Samuel Ryan. We had 2 doctors in this town only in the 200 years we've been here. One was Dr. Samuel Ryan, and he built a schoolhouse for his the little girl who couldn't walk that 2 miles she would have had to walk to school. And another, that lasted for about 50 years, and they had as many as 8 or 10 children there at one time.
How many grades did one teacher have to teach in a one-room schoolhouse?
Well, it depended obviously on the number of children in the school, but it went from kindergarten to 12th grade.
The teachers must have been pretty well prepared to handle all those grades.
Well, the preparation of the teachers varied greatly. There were some teachers who were very experienced and some who had just graduated from school themselves. So that you have to say it's pretty difficult to measure the quality of the teaching.
Yes, in fact, one of the older residents told me a story about one member of the school board who was paid $5 for every teacher she could obtain for the school. So she was very eager to get the residents to serve as teachers.
You have to remember that even as late as 1850, the pay for a female school teacher in this town was $5 a month plus board.
Well, and to handle all this, that was low pay, but quite a job. And what were the subjects that were taught?
Well, of course, in the early grades, the 3 R's were emphasized: history, geography. Very great emphasis on grammar and spelling. Spelling bees were actually, they tell us that the school committee, when they were quizzing a new teacher, would put the teacher through a spelling quiz.
How large was the school committee?
The school committee was 3 people, and they were quite independent of the selectmen.
I see. And what length was the school year?
Well, this school had a little longer number of weeks than other schools. They had a fall session which would run for 10 or 12 weeks, starting in October, and a spring session starting in April, which would run for another 10 or 12 weeks. But of course, the spring sessions running into the summer were less well attended because the children had to work on the farms.
Yes. What about winter? Were the winters so bad that the children couldn't get out to school?
Well, I gather that they had no means for calling a school off, so that the school was held for those who would get here.
Yes. So that was a very limited school year, wasn't it?
Well,
you get all that information in.
Between 20 and 23 weeks per year were the average throughout the 19th century.
What materials did the school provide? Did they give the children the books, the paper?
No, the children had to buy their own books, but they were usually passed on from one student to another, so that they used the old books. But the state required them to report on all the books that they used as part of the instructional material.
With all those ages of children in one class, there must have been some misbehaving, and how was discipline handled?
Well, in this school, the girls all lived on that side, or sat on that side, the east side of the school building, and on this side, the west side, the boys sat. And if somebody misbehaved, the mildest form of punishment was to make a boy sit on the girls' side, and a girl sit on the boys' side. But if that didn't work, the teacher who sat over there would require the student to sit under the teacher's desk and be the object of scorn, or stand in the corner on one foot. But they had, when the ruler or switch was used, that was
serious business, because that sitting on one side or the other, that would work up to a certain age, but I guess when they got into their teens, some of them might have enjoyed that punishment. So.
We're told that one day the kids put a hen in a small chicken, I guess you'd say, in the teacher's desk. And when the teacher lifted up the cover, the hen flew out. But never be able to find that particular student to punish.
Did they have a recess? Were they able to go out to play during the school day?
Oh yes, yeah. The road out here was, of course, a gravel road, and that was a place where they played games. They played a game called square ball. Square ball was just like modern day baseball, long before Abner Doubleday came along. The only difference was that they had 4 bases, and home plate was different from fourth base. And they could put out a runner by hitting him with a thrown ball as well as tagging him.
When did this building stop being used as a schoolhouse and become the site of town activities and voting?
Well, actually, they started holding town meetings here in the early part of this century, in the early 1900s, when the school actually stopped having students in 1919. They just ran out. There were only 2 or 3 students left. So those students were sent to Peterborough starting about in 1920.
Because the other schools weren't functioning at that time. I understand the small Cape, the other one, had burned down in 1918, one of the schools.
Well, no, actually it burned down after this.
After this.
Within the year after the school had stopped.
So from then on it was Peterborough.
The point you have to remember is that Sharon had over 450 residents in the early 1800s, but it dropped down to 20 or 21 in 1920. And this meant that the life in this town changed dramatically during those years. Of course, people left town to work in the cities, they left town to farm in the Midwest where there were no stones, etc.
Yeah. And what happened to Sharon in the 20th century?
Well, the recovery of Sharon is another whole story. I think you have to give the residents of this town a tremendous amount of credit for never giving up. A lot of people thought that the town of Sharon would just cease to exist because the buildings were allowed to go to rack and ruin. But there was a hardcore of sturdy people who insisted upon keeping Sharon going, and they did. And then gradually in the 30s and 40s, it began to pick up. Some people came here because autos made a big difference. Once you could travel, then it was possible for people to get here. But it's still, I get what the current population is about 300, and that compares with over 450 years ago. So we're still not back to where we were.
Maximum capacity that we had before. And what have you found that Sharon has meant to the people who lived here in the past and those who live here now?
Well, Archibald MacLeish once said, a town is not a place, it is the people that live in it and their ideas about it. And I think you could say that the people in this town have liked to be independent. They've liked the freedom and isolation. They have, in fact, encouraged the obscurity that has existed here. If we were called a lost village, they liked it that way.
We didn't want anyone to find us.
And I think if you ask people today how they wanted Sharon to be, they say, just don't let it change.
I agree with that. And thank you so much, Abe. And we'll be looking forward to your history of Sharon.
Bye.
We're at Silver Ranch in Jeffrey, waiting for Alfred Sawyer to arrive. And here he comes now.
About the right way today, isn't it? Hello, Lorraine.
Hi, Alfred. This is quite an interesting carriage.
Yes, this typical of the carriage that the country person might have had to go to church with on the Sunday. It took Mrs. Coolidge to her family reunion back about 1900, and then it was put in a barn and kept there, and I bought it about 20 years ago, and we drive weddings with it now quite occasionally.
That must be pretty colorful. It must have been fun riding in this.
It's comfortable, and a nice little Morgan horse makes a pretty enjoyable group for 4 people to go out and do what they want.
I should say it does.
First name again?
Lorraine.
Lorraine.
Hi, Alfred. Although you were born and brought up here in Jeffrey, Alfred, your family goes way back in Sharon, does it not?
We've been around here about 12, 13 generations. They came here from England, landed at Newbury, Mass, came up through Groton, Townsend, Sharon, and then squatted here in Jeffrey, and there we've stayed.
Where in Sharon did you live?
Well,
Or the family lived?
if I tried to tell you the truth, I'd probably have some history, and history is 1/3 fact and 1/3 what you think you remember or somebody else does, and 1/3 what you wish it were. And so I know they lived in several places in Sharon.
Were your ancestors farmers?
Yes, I think our family has been basically farmers, although the word Sawyer, as it originated in England, it shows that they sawed wood for a livelihood. And I don't recall knowing of any time that they've literally run sawmills since they've been in this area.
Wasn't one of your ancestors the toll taker for the turnpike here?
Yes, Josiah and Margaret French Sawyer were in charge of the 3rd Turnpike toll in Sharon. They lived at the toll house, and their son Cummings was born there. And back in the 1800s, there were no large public funds for building roads, and so private enterprise desiring to have commerce got together, raised the funds, and issued stock and built turnpikes. And if you wanted to get to market with your goods or visit neighboring communities, you went through a turnpike and paid a toll. But the New Englanders were sometimes thrifty and sometimes shrewd, and they soon found ways around certain turnpikes. And so the turnpikes did not last very long. About 20 years that 3rd Turnpike was in existence and paying tolls. And then it got so that you had to have public subscription to build roads. But the tavern owners wanted the business in food and lodging that the coaches brought in, and so they were highly influential in where the principal roads went and when the turnpikes were established.
That's understandable. What were some of the old taverns, especially in Sharon, Alfred?
Well, if I knew where more of them were, I could go and point them out, but I'm afraid I don't literally know. What I can say is that in the days of coaching, every 6, 8, 10, 12, 15 miles would be a tavern, depending on the context of the road. If the road is rough, stony, sandy, steep, taverns would be located not more than 6 or 8 miles apart. If the road was pretty good, they might go 12 or 15 miles. And a post was between 2 taverns. And at the time you reached the next posting inn, you changed your horses, which were usually 4, occasionally 6. 4 new horses were put on. They went about 10 miles or approximately 1 hour. And then the coachman, who was driving the same coach road day after day, might drive 40 or 50 different horses and might drive 80 to 100 miles, but he went up the road and the next day he went back down the road, and the same horses were changed again, went back to their original barn, and that's what coaching was all about, 10 miles an hour.
Well, I understand that in Sharon, the first tavern was run by Samuel and Jane Gregg, and